Hi everybody. Pretty exciting to see what you guys were doing. I've been sitting through a couple of the earlier presentations. Super fun. You guys are kind of badass. It's pretty fun to watch. I'm impressed. So today what I want to do is a little bit lighter fare. I'm not going to make you solve any equations or anything. I'm a professor over in 3D animation and game design. We teach the video game, both art creation and programming here on campus. I think some of you might have been. Every fall we have an upgrade conference specifically for high school students to come on. If you're interested in that conference, make sure you talk to me afterwards because we're super excited to have you there. So as part of the 3D animation game design curriculum, we teach a course called History of Video Games. And it's a super fun course. We play a lot of games, we talk about games, we break the games down, kind of making sure that we understand both the aesthetic kind of components to video game design, the interactive experience of video game design, and the technology, because we're not only drawing and modeling but writing code. It becomes kind of central. As part of that course, we do a section on VR and AR. When Dr. Salfin first contacted me and said, hey, can you do a presentation on the history of computers? You got 45 minutes. I was like, oh, 45 minutes on the history of computers, that's an awful lot. I said, well, how about we do a presentation on the history of video games? And he was like, oh, that's okay. And I was like, well, how about we narrow it more? We're going to talk about VR and AR. I think that that's what we're going to be focusing on today. Partly because there's probably some stuff about VR and AR that you haven't considered, that you haven't seen before. How many of you have had one of these HMDs on your face? Okay, interesting. How many of you have not? Also interesting, right? That's happening. When VR first kind of burst onto the scene, the promise was everybody's going to have these things, right? And in fact, a lot of it is ubiquitous. If you've got a PS5, I don't know if you've played with the new PS5 VR2, but it is an amazing piece of technology. It uses eye tracking, right? It understands what you're looking at and can depth filter out and blur things that are not, that your eye isn't focused on. I mean, the technology has come an amazing amount of distance in a very short amount of time. What I want to do, though, is kind of help everybody understand that this is not a new technology. So, for instance, if we're looking at kind of the three big players today, they are these. Who are they? Oculus. Yeah, Meta, right? PlayStation, right? Yeah, okay, good. Oculus is really Facebook, right? Which is really Meta, right? We know that, right? That beast, right? That has taken over. But what really kind of came on was the establishment of a company called Oculus. Now, a lot of this was in 2012. So, how old were you in 2012? 5 or 6? All right. So at that time, it was super exciting, right? Everybody was like, oh my gosh, like VR. I was one of the initial investors in this technology when it first came out. So I had one of the developer kits, developed some stuff. And in fact, my early career was all built around VR training for nuclear bomb diffusers. So the people who would diffuse nuclear weapons that they had found, because if they screwed up, like all of northern New Mexico, Colorado, and chunks of Texas were gone, right? So it was kind of important that they were able to practice. And so we were creating VR tools at Los Alamos National Laboratory. If you've seen Oppenheimer, that laboratory, that's where we're at. That's what we're building. But even when we're looking at 2012, when you were 5 or 6, it turns out that VR and AR is actually much older than that. A lot older. How old were you in the 1800s? Oh, wait. All right, good. Okay, yes, 17. Good. So what happened is early in the 1800s is what you're looking at there is a painting that was originally built in a circle. Okay, it was in this big space. So what would happen is that you would walk into the space, and then everywhere you looked, you would be surrounded by this painting of this battle, right? It was kind of one of the first attempts, or one of the ones we're going to talk about anyway, at an immersive experience. These ideas of trying to have an immersive experience through art, through design, through some sort of interactivity is not new, right? It's been around for a long time. In fact, when we get to the mid-1800s, we start to have lots of interesting tools and toys. Anybody recognize that? Have you ever played with one of those? What does stereo optics mean? What's stereo for sound? Yeah, stereo really has to do with two, right? With two sides. But yeah, stereo optic means that you're seeing something differently through both eyes, right? It's when we're looking at each other, assuming that both of your eyes work, we are looking stereooptically. It's the reason why we can sense depth, right? That's going on. So what would happen is this is a toy from the 1830s that what they would do is they would set up two cameras that were roughly the distance apart as your eyeballs, take the photograph. There would be two photos taken from a slightly different angle that you would then look through that device. And as you looked at the photograph, you saw it in 3D. Come on, that's pretty cool, yeah? 1838, right, that we were starting to see that. Now, you've probably played with this maybe when you were younger. We're going to talk about some other 3D tools. But for instance, by the time we got to 1849, we were looking at projects like this. This was called a lenticular stereoscope. What it was aimed to do is it was selling virtual tourism. That was actually the term that they were using in 1849, was virtual tourism, so that you could see photographs or hand drawings created in stereo optics, and you could see them in 3D so that they actually had depth. Now, we're going to skip forward to 1929. What is that? That's right. That is a flight simulator. That's exactly what that is. Edward Link was the name of the scientist who worked with this. This is called actually the Link Trainer. What it was one of the first examples of commercial flight simulator training, right, that we're able to look at. 1930s, right, that was happening. The U.S. military buys 6 of them right away. The U.S. military has been kind of a driver, particularly of AR and VR technology all along the way. They pay $3,500 for them. Today, it's about $50,000. So they're buying them at $50,000 a pop, right, that they're willing to kind of put this in. Now, by the time we get to the 1930s, then these ideas of VR, right, of virtual kind of experiences are everywhere. Stanley Weinbaum, he was a sci-fi writer, and he had developed this idea of, in one of his short stories, he called them Pygmalion spectacles. And the idea was these were goggles that you could wear that would allow a person to experience a location that they had never visited before. That as they turned their heads, then they could see what was to their left. As they looked up and down, they could look up. Does this sound familiar? Right? I mean, this idea has been around for a long time. Of course, his Pygmalion spectacles also included things like taste and smell, sound, a bunch of other things that were there. Now, come on, you guys, please, your parents loved you enough that you had one of these? Sometime in your life, somebody loved you enough to let you use one of those, yeah? If they didn't, come talk to me, I'll lend you one, right? I'll love you enough to lend you one, right? They're pretty cool. I don't know, do you remember those? Stereo, right? Stereo optics, right? That you could actually see. The Viewmaster was actually originally not pitched as a kid's toy, but as an adult method of virtual tourism, right? It kind of found its way to children later as it goes on, but super hands-on. Take a look at this cool tool. The man on the right is filming. The man on the left is watching the film. This was called a sensorama, and it actually did create smells and sound and stereo optic visuals as we were working with it. It had a vibrating chair, right? So that as a device came by, you could feel it vibrating, right? I mean, haptic feedback is something you're probably familiar with if you've already played with an Xbox or PlayStation controller. Yeah. No, afterwards. It was recorded. Yeah, it's a good question. So we still see this by 50s, right? We're kind of chewing. Yes, go ahead. Yeah, smell would be produced as well. There was a limited number of smells. But for instance, I mean, your olfactory, right, as you start to think about smell is more tightly connected to memory than any of your other senses. It's the reason why you probably had this experience, right? You walk in and you smell baking bread or fresh tortillas or whatever it is, right? And suddenly it takes you to grandma's, right? That's happening there. Like it's immediate that happens. In fact, this is one of those things that many people in the VR community are very, very excited about, is ways that we can actually tie into smell as we're working on that. Yeah.
This would be an introduction, first time 3D movies.
Well, sort of. These were very, very short, right? And these were not interactive movies. So, I mean, as we're talking today, we're going to be talking about two different things. Like, you probably have gone to a film in stereoscopic, right? Stereo optics, stereoscopic 3D, right? That it's probably before you were born, but there was a time that people were arguing that everybody's TVs would be 3D, right? I mean, you guys probably played with those with the 3DS. Yeah, and the first thing you do is turn that damn 3DS, the 3D stuff off, right? It just like made your head hurt, right? I mean, just bizarre experience. But that's a much different experience than a VR experience where you're actually able to turn your head and see, right? You determine where you're looking at. But probably the earliest of stereoscopic films, we could probably think of it that way. But these are still big units, right? I mean, these are not head-mounted displays. These are not HMDs. These are not the kinds of things that you're used to kind of playing with when you look at 3D. But take a look at this. 1960s, right? Morton Helig was already working with these kinds of 3D goggles. This was one of the first head-mounted displays. It did not track your location, so you couldn't turn your head, for instance, to see different parts, but it was still stereo optics mounted to your face. Now this becomes important. I don't know if you guys have been watching. Apple has now released their new head-mounted display. It's $3,500, right? It has twice the computing power that your strongest laptop does, right? That's why it's $3,500. But it's kind of does some exquisite things. If you have an iPhone 15, you can record video in stereo optics to play back on that headset, right? Kind of some super interesting things. But this idea, much earlier, right? 1960s. Stereoscopic, had wide vision. Part of the problem with, I don't know if you've ever played with these HMDs, but sometimes there's a problem that you feel like your head's in a box or something, right? It's kind of dark on the edge. This one had a real wide vision, so you had a very wide peripheral kind of experience as you were working with it. By the time we get to 1961, we start to have solutions like this. See what that guy's standing on? Yeah, what it meant is he could walk in place, right? So he would have the head-mounted display on his head, but he could walk so that his body could start to have this experience as well. So it's called the head sight. It had a separate video screen for each eye, a tremendous amount of processing power to be actually able to do this. Also didn't allow for a lot of kind of turning your head sorts of things, but did allow for a kind of full body kinematic experience. All right, so this is where we start to get kind of interesting. By the time we get to 1965, there's a man named Evan Sutherland. Sutherland was kind of an interesting guy. He had worked at New York Tech. He worked with a group. For instance, there was a guy there named Ed Catmull. Does that name sound familiar to anybody? Okay. Ed Catmull now is president of a little company you may have heard of called Pixar. Right? So like the first 3D hand that was ever in a movie was Ed Catmull. For those of us who do 3D, there's something called a Catmull subdivision. That's him, right? That's the dude. Him and Sutherland were buddies. But Sutherland proposed this kind of theoretical 1965, he called it the ultimate display. And what he argued is that it would not only be recorded video, but it would be driven by a computer. And that it would provide both haptic, which means tactile kind of feedback, and it would also include things like sound and video. And in fact, these are what some of the first experiments looked like. It was huge, right? It was connected to computers, which at that time were the size of this room, literally, right? So you would strap yourself into this and you could actually move within the space, but it was connected to a computer that was gargantuan. That they do this. But still, what you see is by 1969, you're seeing real 3D, real hand tracking, real stereo-optic kind of interactive experiences. Much earlier, huh? We're still not born yet, right? Maybe some of your teachers are born? No? No? Oh. Maybe your parents? We'll have to see. All right, take a look at this. 1987. This is the first time we hear the term virtual reality. A man named Jaron Lanier, he formed something called the VPL Research Group. You see that glove? 1987 was $9,000. Right? It was a haptic glove that actually not only did you feel things through the glove, but that it would track your movement. Now, I don't know if you guys played with, say, the Quest 2 or the Quest 3? Hand tracking, right? It sees your hands. You don't even have to have controllers. It sees your hands and it sees the digits, right? So you can control things with the digits. This was an idea first kind of introduced in '87, but we just kind of are just now having a chance to work with it. So the data glove, that head-mounted display, it was called the iPhone. iPhone, right, is what that was. The iPhone was $9,400, so what you're looking at is a $18,000 setup there, right, to have that in 1987, which was even more. Anybody ever been to an arcade? Please. Yeah, if you haven't, let's go to one, yeah? Pretty fun, burn through quarters really fast. But VR headsets were a hot thing in '91 arcades. In fact, one of the first things that we did when we were building training modules for Los Alamos National Laboratories is we bought some of these old shells and put new technology inside of them because it had all the mechanical parts that we needed to actually make this stuff work. So there once was a time you could go to the arcade and actually play with what was true virtual reality. Now, the VR output, the graphics were pretty crummy, to be honest, but still a pretty fun experience. All right, come on, you've seen this movie, haven't you? No, huh? Anybody know it? Tron. This movie is called The Lawnmower Man. Look, this is one of the first times that we see the idea of VR kind of introduced to a large audience, right? That the general populace gets a chance to kind of work with it. It was actually working with the iPhone and the iGlove, right, that were happening. Those were the props that they were using, right? The idea is that you have this virtual, I mean, that guy looks pretty scary, right? That they have these kind of virtual experiences. All right, I'm going to move through a few others here so we make sure we've got time. Any guesses who manufactures that thing? Sega. Sega. Probably somebody, your uncle had a Sega, a Dreamcast. You know? Nobody knows about Sega, huh? Oh, you do know about Sega. Okay, good. Yeah, Sega. Well, Nintendo was also in this kind of space, but I mean, take a look at this device. This looks like a pretty cutting-edge VR headset, right? That is happening. This was 1993. It was introduced at the CES show, which was kind of the big consumer electronics show of the time. It did actually have head tracking stereo sound, and it was going to be sold for about $200. It wasn't that expensive. The problem is that the graphics weren't great. It just didn't catch on with folks. People just didn't kind of get very excited about it. And it ended up being a huge commercial flop, along with... Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Virtual Boy, VR32. This was hyped as the first 3D portable device that had true 3D graphics. I don't know if you ever played with one. So the graphics were only in red, only red lines. And you kind of had to hunch over a table that had to stand on a table, right, to use it. Was also just a humongous flop for Nintendo. They discontinued it within a year. But the point here is that you can kind of see people again, kind of emerging and moving into this 3D. All right. Maybe you've seen this movie. Please, yeah, we've seen The Matrix. Oh, dang it. Yeah, I had a student last year whose name was Neo, who had never seen The Matrix. What is happening to this world, right? Super interesting. But look, here's the idea of the Matrix, right? The Matrix is that we are living in a simulation, right? That we are everything that we experience is some sort of computer simulation. Now, this is kind of an interesting idea. It kind of introduces to the zeitgeist this idea that that you could have an experience so real that you're unable to distinguish it from reality. And certainly, I mean, Keanu Reeves, like, right? I mean, nice guy. Whether you love his acting or hate his acting, this is actually a pretty great film. The ones after that, I'll fight you about it. But the first one, really great, right? That happened. So it does some interesting things. All right. So what happens is by this time, everybody's super excited about the idea of a virtual experience. I mean, this is kind of an interesting idea. And a lot of people are working on technologies that will allow for that to happen. Into this space, we have emerged a college dropout. His name is Palmer Luckey. And basically what he does is he kind of looks around and he says, man, this technology exists. It's here. We make lenses that are going to be able to deform something that comes off of a really tiny screen. And we have accelerometers that we can put inside of a device that can track a person's head. We got it. So he started kind of manufacturing this heads-up display, this head-mounted display that was able to do this. I mean, it was taped together with duct tape. I mean, it was the kid, he was like 21, just a young kid. But one day he shows this at the game developers conference to this guy, John Carmack. That's right. In the game industry, when they're talking about the big JC, they're not talking about Jesus Christ, right? They're talking about John Carmack. He's probably one of the most influential game technologists around. He's responsible for games like Doom and Quake, right? Him and a few of his buddies put together one of the original. In fact, the original Doom was this little tangent, but he did this as a shareware. So the idea is you could go to your local Blockbuster Video and you could buy a couple of floppy disks. And what happens is you would go and install this in your home and you could play the first level. And after the first level, then they would say, hey, if you like this game, send $15 by check to this address and we'll send you the rest of the game. And everybody said, nobody's going to do that. And sure enough, only 1.5 million people did. Right? Him and John Romero, right? They were both like 20 years old. Suddenly came into literally $15 million worth of checks in their mom's mailbox. And since then they formed id Software, which became ZeniMax, right? A bunch of kind of super interesting stuff. John Carmack sees Palmer Luckey's prototype and he's like, this is the thing. And in fact, he quits id Software and goes to work with Palmer Luckey, right, on these projects. This is where we see the first Oculus come out, right, the Oculus Rift. Now, 2012, how old were we then? 6? We were 6? Yeah. You're 19? Yeah, I was 19. I bet I was 19 in 2012, or maybe 10. I don't know. This was a time, it's hard to kind of explain, everybody, what kind of seismic shift this was, right? People in the game industry were like, what is happening here? This is going to change the way everything happens. If you haven't had a VR headset on, come visit our department sometime. I'll stick one on your face. Because what happens is it is an experience, right? I mean, can I get an amen from some of you who've actually had one on your face? Thank you. All right, thank you, my brothers and sisters. This is actually kind of an amazing experience. It's not one you want all the time, right? I mean, yeah. I was using that VR too, and I was climbing, I was climbing cliffs in the, I can't remember which game I was playing, but man, about 20 minutes into that, and I had to go stand in the corner. I was about to lose my lunch, right? But super interesting. What you find is when you experience a VR headset, is what you'll discover is that it's an amazing experience that isn't perfect yet. Does that sound fair? Those of you who've had it on your face, right? That you're like, this is something new, but man, I don't want to play every game this way. I want to sit my butt down on the couch and move my thumbs, right? Is how that works. So what happens is that Paul Berlucky on Kickstarter actually says, I've got this technology that I'd like people to kind of get involved with. And people jump all over it. That's how I got involved with it, right? People jump all over it. So what was pitched as that headset actually ships 2 years later as the headset on the left. I've got one in my office. I'll show you. I got one of these originals, and they're pretty interesting. It was using a package called Unity. I don't know if any of you guys have ever used the Unity game engine, right? Right now, there's kind of two large consumer game engines. There's Unity and Unreal. Unreal is beautiful. Unity is far easier to develop on, and so a lot of so programmers really like Unity. So all of the tools were in Unity, which meant you could have run it off your Mac, you could run it off your PC, you could have done everything you want. Now, the thing that becomes important about this is a head-mounted display. It's just the display. That means that it had to be tethered to a computer, that computer would actually draw the things that happened on the screen. So as you were moving your head around, it was sending the information back to the computer. The computer was then shooting back what display to actually show on it. Now, that's super fun until you decide to stand up, right? And then you're tethered to at that time, you couldn't run it off a laptop. It had to be a big PC, and you'd stand up and, you'd knock stuff over, and it was kind of a big hassle. But this becomes very exciting because very soon after that, the Zuckerberg, right? He buys Oculus. Well, Facebook buys Oculus for $2 billion. Now listen, this is what I want all of you smart people to think about. Zuckerberg, Facebook, why would he buy Oculus? The internet too. What do you think that means? Yeah, the metaverse. I love that. The metaverse. That's right. Yeah, right. Look, this is what I would postulate to you, everybody, right? Is VR, the ultimate goal here is not solo video games, right? Zuckerberg buys this because he is seeing VR as an interactive, shared experience that people have with each other in a virtual space, right? I don't know if you saw the movie Ready Player One, kind of not all that exciting a movie, but the book is full of super interesting ideas. And it is all built on this idea of this shared experience that is happening in this VR space. And this is what we're seeing. We're seeing people who are interested in social interactions buying the largest VR technologies in the world. Yeah? Soon after that, we see lots of other competition kind of going on. Valve, for instance, they developed their own competitor. You can see all sorts of cool stuff. You see kind of the QR codes on the walls so they could track the location that was happening. What happens soon after that is that Valve starts to release tools like this that are super interesting because you can have really, really long tether. And what those boxes are, they would call them lighthouses. And so you could set up a playing area that was 10 by 10. And so suddenly you could get up, you could walk around, right? You could move, you could paint in 3D, right? When I put my kid, I had a 6-year-old at the time, and the first thing she did is she drew a tent and went in and laid underneath the tent, right? I mean, you were drawing environments that you could then interact with in kind of really super interesting ways. Soon after, Oculus builds similar technologies. These are technologies that are all built on the idea that you don't have to be sitting, right? You can get up and move, which goes a long way towards that. And 2017, this is kind of the magic year because by this point, we see Oculus and Valve locked hand in hand with these super interesting competing packages. They're both about $1,200 a piece. And then little old Sony decides to release their version for $200 a piece. Did you guys play with this one? No? Didn't get it. Yeah, interesting, right? Kind of big, kind of heavy, right? Makes you kind of fall over, but super inexpensive, right? And suddenly you could drive it off your PS4. You didn't have to have a $3,000 computer, right, to drive it. So this becomes kind of the start of what is really this amazing explosion of VR opportunities, right? Uh, you see that one at the top? That's made out of cardboard, and you put your phone in it, right? And since your phone has an accelerometer, then suddenly you can have, I mean, this is from a project I did for the Natural History Museum in Los Angeles. And what was happening is that they would pass out this cardboard, you'd put your phone in it, and suddenly you'd have a VR experience by just holding it up to your face. It would track your head, right, in rotation, translation, did kind of an amazing amount of things. Yeah? What it means is there's lots of opportunities, especially with phones, right, to do this. There's a company here in San Antonio called Verge, and they make kind of a purple, foamy headset. Now they're kind of focused on this cube that does AR, but these headsets are kind of make it so that anybody can work with it. All right. So can I talk geek for a second here? We can talk geek, right? I want to introduce you to this idea of presence, okay? We're going to talk theoretically here for a second. This man's name is Michael Abrish. Michael Abrish started at Valve, but ended up at Oculus. What he did is he postulates this idea that true VR requires something called presence. And he's kind of basically is looking at these 5 issues: tracking, latency, low persistence, resolution, and optics. I'm going to pound through these really quick because you guys are smart folks, so we can kind of look through this. But he argues that in order for us to have a truly immersive experience, one in which we feel that we have presence in that virtual environment, then we have to be able to do these things. Now, when he postulated these technical specifications, nobody could do them. Okay, nobody could do them. So the first one is tracking. The idea of tracking is that you have 6 degrees of freedom. 6 degrees of freedom means that you can not only rotate, but you can also translate in space, okay, so that you can look up and down. He argues that you had to have 360-degree tracking so that you could look around, you could look up and down, and it had to have sub-millimeter accuracy. What happens is if you turn your head and the video is off by just millimeters, your brain doesn't tolerate it, and you lose your lunch, right? It has to be super duper accurate. There can't be any jitter as you turn your head, and it has to have what's called a comfortable tracking volume, meaning that if you have to sit like this and you can only move your head like this, you're not going to feel like you're there. You got to be able to kind of move through a larger space. So latency, we know this word? Latency, so those of you who are video game players, right, you probably know about latency and ping, right? The idea of how many milliseconds it takes for information to get from you to the server and back. This is a big deal if you're playing, if you're playing Fortnite or some other real game, not a stupid game, right? And you need to, and somebody's shooting a rocket at you, you better have a low latency, right? Unless you're playing Fortnite, then who cares? Okay. So basically the idea is that he had to have less than 20 milliseconds between any sort of interaction and the output. What he was doing was talking about this idea of there's a tracker inside of your headset that talks out to the CPU, which then has to talk to the GPU, which then sends information back to your head-mounted display. So, I mean, think about the computing power that has to happen here, right? It's kind of amazing that we can look with it. The idea then is that when you are seeing that information, that there has to be what's called low persistence. That's the ability for pixels to flip on and off, for colors to change, has to change at a rate that, I mean, probably nobody, your home computer, maybe you have a 120 hertz monitor, but probably most of you don't, right? So he was arguing that you had to have at least 90 hertz strapped to your face. And then he particularly talks about resolution. This is a big deal. I don't know if you've played with the early ones, but sometimes you have a screen on your face and your eyes can see the individual pixels on the screen. It's like you're looking through a screen door. Like it doesn't work, right? As soon as you do that, you're like, well, I'm not really in that place, right? I'm not there. So he argues that we had to have 1,000 by 1,000 pixels per eye. Now your computer at home probably is running 1280 by 720, 1,280 pixels by 720. He was arguing that there needs to be 1,000 on each screen for each eye, right? Can you see what's happening here? This is the only way you're going to have no visible pixel structure. And then finally, this idea, we've already talked about it, these wide fields of views. You have to have a comfortable eye box so that the lens isn't actually touching your eyeballs. That we have to be able to work with calibration and adjustments. Now, I need you to understand, this is what the most recent Oculus looks like. Do you see those specs? Yeah, it's probably way better than your monitor, but it also accomplishes presence, right? Technologically. This is the Vive version. This is the crummy PS4 version, right? This is the new PS5 version. That it is a technological masterpiece. It's amazing. You're no longer controlling the interface with your fingers. You just look at things and it highlights them, right? You look at things for a certain amount of time. If you put your hand out in front of your face and you look at your hand, what happens to everything behind your hand? Try it. Yeah, that's right. Your hand is in focus. What happens to everything behind it? Blurry. This tracks what you're looking at and makes the other things blurry, right, behind it. Can you see how we're moving towards this, right? That happens. What I'm trying to say is that this kind of technology has been moving along in a way that even now phones are at a high enough resolution that they can support it, right? There are other sorts of new technologies like the Quest that no longer are attached to computers. They're standalone, right? They stand by themselves. So suddenly you can set up a space as big as this room. There are VR sandboxes here in San Antonio where you can go with your friends. You can all put on VR headsets and you can play Squid Games. Right? Like you can run around each other because it's tracking where each location is. Has anybody been to them? No? Oh, look it up this week. You like it?
Yeah, it's got an iffy experience because it's like you know that you're in a box, but it really doesn't matter because most of the time you're just staying in a box, staying in like one place.
Right. That's always the scary part, right? When you can't see your environment is whether you're going to run into a wall, right? You've seen those videos of people playing the game where they're walking out on the ledge, right? And they jump, smash into their wall or whatever's happening. Yeah, good times. All right. Okay, so I've got a bunch of other kinds of things that I want to talk about theoretically, but I've only got 6 minutes left. So I want to, what kind of questions have you got? Let's talk about this for a second. Go ahead.
What's the difference between AR and VR?
Okay, thanks. Yeah. So AR and VR, let me see. I think you have experienced AR. Anybody ever seen a football game on television? That's AR. Those players can't see those lines, right? The blue and the yellow, right? You can, but they can't, right? Did you guys ever play Pokemon? You go, yeah, you know what AR is, right? It's you find Pokemon Go, right? You find these. What it is that you're looking through a virtual instrument, a phone or whatever it is, and then there's some three-dimensional item that shows up. You've seen this actually in television, right? This is happening. I mean, I know your generation doesn't watch the news, but in news, it's all over the place, right? AR kind of happens everywhere. There's all sorts of interesting tools like this. In fact, if you go at IKEA right now, you can download an app. In fact, Amazon allows you to do it too. That you want to see what a piece of furniture looks like in your room, you look through your phone, you say plunk it right there, and it shows you the size, how it would fit in your room, what's happening. That's what augmented reality is. That's the difference. Yeah. Yeah.
So I have a Quest 2, and every time I use it, I feel like I'm gonna throw up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't like that. So do they have like a solution to that problem, or they know why it happens?
Oh, this is super interesting. There's a lot of kind of. Do you get car sick?
No, I don't. I don't get car sick usually. My sister does. I don't.
Yeah, there's some interesting things. There's a lot of some people are postulating it's an inner ear thing, right? Is that your inner ear is not communicating that you're moving and stopping in space, and therefore, when your inner ear is not communicating to your brain that that's happening, but your eyes are communicating to your brain that that's happening, then it can make you not feel well. There's been some other kind of interesting experiments with putting a fake nose, a virtual nose, in the so that when you're playing the game, you can see your nose, and that helps diminish the feeling sick. The reality of it is it's still an emerging field, and they're still trying to figure it out. It's interesting because when I'm teaching this in class, I'll have some students who can be living in that headset for 6 hours straight, and others that 10 minutes they're like, I'm out, right? I can't do it. So there is some kind of individual experiences, but of course, in order for this to work, it's got to work well for everybody. So it's still emerging.
Since you mentioned that they're integrating smell earlier, have any of the big kind of VR companies been trying to integrate smell? And I know haptic gloves a lot more available consumer-ready products.
Yeah, I think probably, to be honest with you, I would suspect that the first time we're going to really experience smell is when we've got a chip implanted in our brain. And I don't say this flippantly, right? The device is able to communicate with that and trigger the smell kinds of experiences. Every time you try these kind of smelloramas or whatever they are, like it's just weird. Yeah, and there's only so many mixtures. There are some interesting experiments, though, right? One company has claimed that they could recreate any smell with a very finite collection of ingredients. But still, imagine refilling your smell bottles, right, every time you play. I think it's kind of weird.
Why did you say with the new PlayStation VR headset with the technological magnitude?
It's great. I mean, for all the reasons that I talked about, right? The idea of eye tracking, right? Being able to bifurcate what your view is. It's great, and it's not very expensive. That's the thing that I love about it. It also, you're able to move. It does hand tracking. It does a lot of the things that the big tools do, but for a fraction of the cost.
I was going to ask the VR myself. How's the VR program in this particular college? Like, is it just part of game design, or is there some classes for it?
It's just part of the game design programs. That's right. VR. Here's the bottom line, right? Is the VR has not taken off like we thought that it would, right? We thought that it was going to be ubiquitous, it was going to be everywhere. But I mean, half of you have never had a VR headset on, right? So what we are always trying to do is that the technologies associated with VR are the same whether you're using VR or a regular game. So we kind of teach those, but especially in the programming class, they go all in. We have a stack of 30 VR headsets. We check them out to every student, and we do some VR projects along the way. All right, I got 1 minute. Yeah.
Will VR take away any current business, like movies?
That certainly has been one of the fears early on, but you and I probably remember a time when 3D stereo optic glasses, right, that everybody was going to have one of those TVs in their house, and it was going to revolutionize the way we did TVs, but that kind of came and left, right? It kind of came and went. I would be surprised if it unseated movies in that way. Currently, almost all the focus is on interactive game experiences. That could change, and anybody who predicts the future is a fool, but here I am predicting the future foolishly. But I would be surprised if it unseated movies. I think it might change the way we make them, though, for sure. All right, everybody, thanks very much. Appreciate your time. Enjoy lunch.